All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Derek Coy, and I am a senior program officer for Veterans Health here at the New York Health Foundation. I'd love to first start off by thanking you all for joining us today. I truly appreciate it. I'm at the foundation's headquarters in New York City, so it is with honor and gratitude that I acknowledge the land itself and the Lenape people who have stewarded it for countless generations over the course of 400 years before being displaced. I'm super excited to be in conversation today with our incredible guest, Dr. Matthew Delmont, the Sherman Fairchild Distinguished Professor of History at Dartmouth College and author of Half American, the epic story of African Americans fighting World War II at home and abroad, which we'll be discussing today. But before we jump into the conversation, I would like to first start off with a few housekeeping notes. We'll have a little time toward the end of our program for a few questions from the audience, so keep that in mind throughout the course of the conversation. We'd love to hear from you. Also, in addition to an excellent guest, we also have a great audience joining us today, so feedback and engagement in general is welcome. Feel free to send comments or share any contact info you'd like there as well. For our hearing impaired attendees like myself or anyone else in need of live stream captioning, you can click on the closed caption icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen and select the show subtitles and or full transcript options there. Lastly, just a heads up, this webinar is being recorded, so we'll be sure to send out an event recap email with a link to the video that will be sent to everyone in the next few days, so be sure to keep an eye out for that. And without further ado, I'm very excited to kick off this conversation and get things started. First, by thanking you, Dr. Delmont, for joining us today. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. It's good to talk to you, Derek. Thank you for the invitation, and hi to everyone watching the webinar.
Yeah, truly a pleasure to have you, and we really appreciate that. For a little context, I was super jazzed to receive your book, Half American, in the mail thanks to your partnership with the Black Veterans Project, an amazing organization doing phenomenal work that I would highly recommend folks in the audience check out in case you aren't familiar with them. As both an historian and a bibliophile, in addition to someone who focuses on the veteran community in my professional work, I have to say, for numerous reasons, this is an incredible book. So I'd first like to ask you, out of all the primary sources and easily 1,000+ books written on various topics pertaining to World War II, what inspired you to add to this field of scholarship and write this book in particular?
So this book, Half American, actually grew out of my last book project. I did a digital book project for Stanford University Press called Black Quotidian. So if the audience members were to search blackquotidian.org, you'd find this digital book project from Stanford. And for that project, I looked through different Black newspapers, papers like the Pittsburgh Courier, Chicago Defender, and just would go to different historical dates and try to get a better understanding of what people were reading about at that point in history. When I was looking at papers from the war years, 1941, 42, 43, I kept coming across pictures and stories about the more than 1 million Black men and women who served the country during World War II. And these weren't famous people. These were just average citizens from Chicago, from Cleveland, from Los Angeles. And they were small pictures and little kind of capsule stories about different people who had been drafted into or volunteered for the Army, Navy, or Marine Corps. You know, I'm a historian, so I've taught about this topic for more than a decade, but seeing these stories of these everyday people, it really opened my eyes and it made me curious. And so that was about 7 years ago. I wanted to know more about the Black perspective of World War II, just to get a better understanding of what Black Americans experienced during the war. And so that really propelled me to do the research that led to Half American.
Gotcha. So I'm quasi well-versed in World War II history, but I have to say, I think on literally every page, I either learned something completely new or had my perspective changed by something that you wrote. And one thing in particular that stood out of the many that was new to me was the Double V campaign. And maybe to start with that, could you tell us more about what that was and how it pertains to the larger scope and goal of the book?
Absolutely. So the Double Victory campaign was really the rallying cry for Black Americans during the war. Maybe as a way to get there, let me explain where the title of my book comes from.
Please.
So the title of the book is Half American, and it comes from a letter that a man named James Thompson wrote to the Pittsburgh Courier in December of 1941. James Thompson was a 26-year-old from Wichita, Kansas, and he's writing after the bombing of Pearl Harbor because he knows that he and other Black Americans are about to be drafted into the military. And at that time, during the entirety of World War II, the military is racially segregated. And so the letter that James Thompson writes to the Pittsburgh Courier, he asks a series of very pointed and pressing questions. He writes, should I sacrifice my life to live half American? Is the America I know worth defending? And that phrase just really stuck with me. Should I sacrifice my life to live half American? Because Thompson and others are asking, what does it mean to be asked to defend a country that doesn't yet treat you as a full citizen? the Courier uses Thompson's letter to launch this double victory campaign, the double V. And it stands for victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. And I mentioned I've taught about this topic for more than a decade. And I've sometimes just treated that as a rhetorical framework, as like a slogan that kind of roused Black people during the war. But it was much more than just a clever turn of phrase. It really was a two-front battle for Black Americans. They were committed to helping to win the military part of the war, but they were also convinced that that wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to defeat the Nazis in the European theater. It wasn't enough to defeat the Japanese military in the Pacific. They had to be able to come home and have actual freedom and democracy at home. And so part of what I try to trace in the book was that for Black Americans during the war and after the war, those two campaigns for victory were always intertwined. They're always trying to help win the military battles, while also recognizing that they had to have actual freedom and democracy here in the United States.
Yeah, thank you for breaking that down, because I felt the same way. I think you can hear what it means just at face value, but there's so much more meaning behind that. And I think another thing you do an excellent job of is explaining that. Also, I think another common theme that I believe permeated this book was the idea of hypocrisy, exclusively I'd say on behalf of the United States regarding what it alleged it was fighting for, fighting against. And one of the many poignant examples you gave was of historian John Hope Franklin, who volunteered for service in both the Navy and the Army and was turned away despite having a PhD from Harvard. And there were so many other examples that you gave in the book. Could you speak more about how Black Americans first had to fight domestically just for the opportunity to fight abroad?
Absolutely. So the famous historian Stephen Ambrose said that one of the great ironies of World War II was that you had the world's greatest democracy in the United States fighting the world's worst racist, Hitler, with the segregated army. And I would say for Black men and women during World War II, they were living that irony. They recognized the hypocrisy of the United States fighting a war that was in theory about freedom and democracy, fighting it with a segregated army. So in the lead up to World War II, one of the first things civil rights activists and Black newspaper editors have to do is really fight for the opportunity for Black Americans to even have a chance to serve their country. You mentioned John Hope Franklin. He wasn't the only Black person who was turned away from military service. Really, between World War I and World War II, Black Americans were pushed out of military service because the military leaders had very retrograde and frankly racist ideas about the capacities of Black men and women. They didn't think that they had the intelligence, courage, and bravery to serve it in the military. So in the lead up to World War II, civil rights activists are fighting just to get an opportunity for Black men and women to serve. What that means is that they're trying to create more units within the Army to accommodate more Black soldiers. Within the Navy, Black men are only allowed to serve as mess attendants, where they essentially wait on and serve white officers. And so the campaign there is to expand more of the ranks and roles within the Navy. And then at the start of the war, the Marine Corps doesn't allow any Black Americans to serve. The commandant of the Marine Corps at the time says he'd rather have a Marine Corps that was 5,000 white Marines than 25,000 Black Marines. And so they're explicitly blocking Black Americans from serving. One of the most difficult things I came across was in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, there were hundreds of Black Americans who went to volunteer for the military. They lined up outside recruiting stations, just like white Americans did, but there were dozens of them that were turned away just because of the color of their skin. And they were just left dumbstruck because they couldn't believe that their willingness, their patriotism, their willingness to serve their country, especially after Pearl Harbor, was being degraded in that way. And so that the blatant hypocrisy that Black Americans understood to be going on during World War II was really something that threaded throughout the war. And it was a consistent refrain in the Black press, particularly.
Yeah, and that's also something I think you did a great job of pointing out. One, that hypocrisy, but two, the idea that these folks kind of, for the most part, knew what they were getting themselves into. And that's what I think is even more brave than we could comprehend, is they still served, record numbers and all these different heroic ways. And a lot of what you said in there, would love to, kind of pull apart and touch on, and hopefully we'll get to a little bit more of that in the conversation. But you laid out excellent examples of the fighting that took place at home just for Black Americans to serve. But of course, that's not where it stopped. There were countless hurdles that they faced once they were serving on active duty in a variety of different ways. So can you tell us a little bit more about the struggles Black service members faced once they were actually able to join, for those folks that were able to join the military?
Absolutely. I mean, the first set of challenges they faced was here in the United States, once they got sent to the Army bases, which were primarily located in the South. So particularly for volunteers and draftees who came from states outside of the South, places like New York, Illinois, Minnesota, California, they would describe getting on the trains and being sent to these Army bases in Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama. When they got to the demarcation points of to transfer into the South, Washington, D.C. and other cities, they had to move to the Jim Crow section of the car. And so they're in military uniforms, but then being forced to sit in a black only section of the train car. When they would pull into these small southern towns, they described having to pull down the shades on the train cars so that the white townspeople wouldn't throw rocks at the train cars, because the townspeople were so upset at the idea that black troops were going to be stationed there. They described day-to-day harassment from white officers and other white enlisted men. And then when they would have 24 hours or 48 hours of recreation to be able to go into these small southern towns, they're cordoned off into one block areas that were the kind of black sections of town. And if they stepped even a foot outside of that, they were harassed or beaten by sheriffs or by white townspeople. Things got so bad that there were hundreds of letters written from these black soldiers up to the NAACP in New York to folks like Thurgood Marshall. And the soldiers were saying, we'll feel safer if we actually deploy to the European theater, the Pacific theater, than we feel on these military bases in the South. And so the language they kept using was that we're at war here in America with our white countrymen before they even have a chance to actually go fight in the military. And I think what's important and powerful about these stories is it's a very different set of stories than we usually tell about the history of World War II. Mm-hmm. We would like to think that our country was united during the war against a common foe or towards a common cause. And in some small cases, that was true. But for Black Americans, their lived experience of the war, particularly for those who were in the military, was one of harassment and in some cases violence here in the United States. When they deployed, things in some cases actually got better, because once they actually had the job to do in the different theaters, then they could focus on something specific, and the kind of harassment tended to die down. And the reception that Black troops described receiving from white Europeans, for example, was eye-opening. They described being treated much better by people in Britain and in France than they were ever treated by white Americans in the South. And so it was really a range of experiences Black soldiers described during the war years.
Yeah, and I appreciate you, I think, describing that range, because, it does vary a lot, but it's all for the most part atrocious, and I think very embarrassing. Of course, I think reading Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States was kind of an eye-opener, because I think that did a good job of explaining history through a different lens. And then Michael Adams' book, The Best War Ever, was the first one that I read, was where it's kind of like, yeah, it wasn't as sweet as you think. We weren't as united. And that was a turning point for me. And I think your book does that like times 20, because it's really able to dive into a specific population. And it's just so clear that the way we thought things went down was not the way they went down, and it was actually much worse. You gave an example, and I'm trying to think, but there was a mayor or someone that mentioned that they would literally shoot the first Black troop. Or can you explain a little bit what, I guess, to further the point that you made?
Yeah, so one of the paradoxes of this time period is that if you take ourselves back to 1940, 1941, 1942, there are dramatic changes that happen all across the country as the United States is entering the military. Mm-hmm. One of them is that you have these huge army installations being built in southern states that hadn't been there previously, or relatively small bases being expanded dramatically. Mm-hmm. Southern politicians really campaigned to have those bases built in the South, because they understand that that means a huge inflow of federal resources. Mm-hmm. And so there's a paradox that you have these politicians who are really active in pursuing federal funding to get these bases located in Texas, Alabama, Georgia. But then when it comes to who's going to be stationed at these bases, then they get outraged at the idea that Black troops are going to be sent there. And so the quote you're referring to, it was a mayor of one of these towns in Texas who's writing up to Washington, D.C., say he's successfully campaigned to get a base in his town, but he's writing to Washington, D.C. saying, if you send any Black troops here, I'll shoot the first one that I see. Right? It's disturbing, but it's the reality of what was going on in the country at the time. And I think the thing it helps to reveal for us is that there were competing visions for what the United States was going to be during the war and what the United States was going to be after the war. And I think that's part of why it's important to look honestly at this history, is that the United States was a very complicated, fraught, tense place during the war. Right? There were racial clashes all across the country. In 1943, there were more than 240 race riots or racial clashes in cities, small towns, military bases all across the country. And so I think we do ourselves a disservice today if we look back and think that was a simpler, more peaceful, more unified time, because the reality is when you look at the evidence, it just wasn't, right? Things were as fraught then as they are in some ways now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think kind of to that end as well, the idea that, you have Black troops that are serving on bases named after Confederate generals, something that we've, seen as a very, current topic, sadly. But also I think, that if there are two other things that I think really stood out for me in your book were resilience, because these are the things that, Black troops endured and then still went on to fight heroically and do these amazing things. But also the pressure. I just can't understand what that would be like. So I think regarding the latter first, serving in the military in general is incredibly difficult, more or less by design. But Black service members had so much more pressure on them. Like I said, I can't even really imagine it. And one of the examples you gave of overcoming, many examples of overcoming prejudice, looking at how rampant these issues were, but, from, I guess, basically not just, isolated to people in the South that, their thoughts or actions. It really ran up the highest levels. And you mentioned the quote from, my beloved Marine Corps is really embarrassing and tough to read, but it's super important to know that, General Thomas Holcomb said he'd rather have, 5,000 white troops or 25,000 Black troops. So to that end, can you tell us more about how military leadership in particular perpetrated white supremacist ideology, and maybe more about the 1925 Army War College report that you referenced? I think that's a great example as well.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, taking a broader view of this, one of the most frustrating things for Black Americans in this time period was that Black Americans have served in every military conflict the United States has ever been a part of. They were in the American Revolution, they were in the Civil War, in World War I, and then obviously in World War II as well. And Black Americans understood this. They understood this history. And so to see the kind of disrespect they received from military leaders was deeply upsetting. So taking the story back to World War I, there are more than 300,000 Black Americans who served in World War I, with the hope that by showing their bravery, showing their patriotism, things would get better after the war in terms of equal rights, in terms of civil rights. And in fact, almost the exact opposite happens. They come home to a country that actually implements even stricter racial segregation policies in terms of Jim Crow policies in the South. There was racial violence and race riots, attacks against Black communities in the so-called Red Summer of 1919. And then within the military, there are really intentional efforts to push Black Americans out of the service. And so I appreciate you mentioning the 1925 Army War College report, because one of the, again, most upsetting things to come across in this research was how military leaders at the highest level, people with their backgrounds and training at West Point, who had served as officers and as generals in the Army, when they sat down to do the after action reports from World War I and sort of talk about the capacities of Black troops, they ignored many of the successes of Black units in World War I and referenced instead these pseudoscientific racist theories about the lack of capacity that Black Americans had. And to go back and read that report is absolutely stunning, because they're saying things about the brain capacity or the cranial capacity of Black Americans. They're saying that Black Americans are afraid of the dark, and that's why they can't be good soldiers. They're saying that they shrink from combat. They'll run at the first sign of danger. It goes on for pages and pages, justifying why Black Americans shouldn't be in leadership positions in the military, but then also justifying why they can't even be in combat roles. They really make the case that Black Americans can only serve in some of the most menial or kind of hard, grueling labor work within the military. And again, what's important about it is that it's not just an isolated set of individuals or a handful of racists writing something in a newspaper. This is the official thinking of the Army. This is what they're teaching at West Point. And the big problem is it's one generation of officers, the guys who had served in World War I, they pass on those racist ideas to the next generation of officers who go on to serve in World War II. And it has direct impact. So one of the people I feature in the book is Benjamin O. Davis Jr., who was the first leader of the Tuskegee Airmen. His dad was one of the small handful of Black officers, and Davis Jr. himself graduated from West Point in 1936. He was only the fourth Black American to ever graduate from West Point. Davis, when he graduates, the Army has no idea what to do with him, though, because he wants to be a pilot. And at that time, the Army isn't allowing any Black Americans to be pilots. And so very early on in his military career, he runs up against this kind of racism that is deeply embedded in the Army's culture, because they don't understand what it means to have an intelligent, capable, leader like Davis in the military. They're not able to take advantage of the skills he has to bring to bear. And so it really takes intentional efforts by him, intentional efforts by civil rights activists to open up something like the Tuskegee experiment with the Tuskegee pilots in Alabama. And even then, Davis described sort of day-to-day harassment that they had to prove themselves each and every day. So that point you're making about the pressure, for the people who were the trailblazers in these units, the Tuskegee Airmen, or within the Marines, the Montford Point Marines, having to prove themselves, knowing that they had commanders, direct commanders who didn't think they should be there. Like that was something that they had to deal with on a day-to-day basis. They were not only having to fight enemies, having to fight against Nazis, they were also having to fight against their commanders in some cases to prove themselves worthy of service. And so it's a remarkable and inspiring story, I think, to look back and understand everything that generation went through and how they still served, like how they still truly helped win the war.
Yeah. So much, great things in there that you said. I think one in particular, the idea that this is really institutionalized. When we talk about structural racism, this is where it's, a great example of it being baked in, and basically just giving all these fallacious notions of reality, but at the highest levels. I think Terry Wallace did a great job writing Bloods, basically about Vietnam veterans. Where that was the first time that I heard the idea that, like, not only were you looking out for the enemy in front of you, but you didn't know if your fellow service members on your left or right had your back because of racism. Having Confederate flags on their uniforms or flying them, and this is of course after World War II, so you could see how this permeates and continues unfortunately to this day. I was in the Marine Corps myself, served in Iraq, and again, embarrassing, but it's important to know racism was rampant. It wasn't, and I think it was a little different because a lot of it was under the guise of like humor, a lot of racist jokes, a lot of joking around. But I can't imagine, a generation or two ago where you didn't have to joke. This is very real. But one thing I always want to be sure I don't ever do is think of people or populations monolithically. And you do a great job of that as well in your book by pointing out that, yes, there were countless brave Black Americans that wanted to and did serve, but there were also Black war protesters, conscientious objectors. So in that vein, I'd certainly be remiss if I didn't bring up the topic of Black women that served during World War II, something that you already mentioned. Black folks have served in the military at every war, and I think Harriet Tubman being the first woman to lead a combat mission for the U.S. Army is really a great example. But to note how hard it was for Black men to serve, which you do a excellent job of pointing out, it makes me think of the Ginger Rogers quote where she says, if you think Fred Astaire was great, everything I did everything he did, but backwards and in high heels. And I think of Black women that served in that capacity. So can you tell us more about Black women's contributions to the war efforts in World War II, and then the additional hurdles they faced when they were serving just because they were women?
Absolutely. And Black women are absolutely critical to this history and are very well represented in the book. So since I was just mentioning Tuskegee, one of the things that was actually kind of new to me in doing the research was that I think everyone at this point knows about the Tuskegee Airmen. But when we think about the Tuskegee Airmen, we have to also be thinking about the much larger support staff that was there at the base in Alabama and then deployed with them as well. That included Black nurses who worked at Tuskegee, included meteorologists, included mechanics. And so there were dozens and dozens of Black women who were part of that Tuskegee Air Base who made it possible for the airmen to fly. In the war, the largest unit of Black women to serve was a unit called the 688th Central Postal Directive Battalion that was under the command of Major Charity Adams. They deployed to England in late 1944, and their job was to distribute mail throughout the European theater. That might not seem like a big deal, but it was actually hugely complicated because these units were moving constantly, and you had a lot of guys with common names like Mark Smith or Mark Jones. Mm-hmm. Part of that, why that was so important, is that after the war, all the troops, both Black and white, described how important it was for morale to be able to receive mail from home. So Charity Adams and this postal battalion was really critical to helping boost morale in that way. And there are other Black nurses who served in different theaters. There were a number of Women's Army Corps workers on the home front. Within the Navy, there were the Waves who made inroads within the Navy, some of the first Black women to serve there. Beyond those who served in military duty, there were more than 600,000 Black women who worked in the defense industries at home, so-called Black Rosie the Riveters. And what was important about that is these were occupations and jobs that just weren't available to Black women prior to World War II. Primarily, the major sources of employment outside of the home for Black women prior to the war were usually either in domestic service in white homes or in farms working in agriculture. And so for the interviews that were conducted with these Black women war workers, one of the consistent refrains was, it was the war that helped get them out of white women's kitchens. Like, this is something that helped open up those doors to them. I think to your very important point about the additional obstacles they faced, for these Black women, once the war was over, too often they were pushed out of those war jobs. And so it was the last hired, first fired kind of situation. Once you had men come home, they were pushed out of the work. For the Black women who served in the military, they described the kind of sexism they experienced and racism they experienced, including from some of the Black male troops who weren't as supportive as we might want to imagine them being of seeing Black women in uniform. Mm-hmm. And then even more broadly, I think one of the important threads to the book is that Black women were crucial to helping build out the civil rights infrastructure in the United States. And so some names that become much more well-known later, people like Ella Baker and Rosa Parks, they really get their starts during World War II. Ella Baker is the head of branch recruitment for the NAACP. And so she's traveling all across the country, helping organize local people and really building out the infrastructure of the civil rights movement that takes off after the war. She hosts leadership training workshops and helps educate people like Rosa Parks in what it means to organize their communities. And so this is in 1944, 1945. It really lays the foundation for the much larger explosion of civil rights activism that comes in the 1950s. And so all of that work is really being led by Black women during the war.
Yeah, thank you for breaking that down, because again, I think admittedly, I kind of like knew a little bit about this, but it's definitely not to the level now that thankfully in your book you break down. And I think it's super important. You know, like I said, I want to do a better job of that, and appreciate you putting me onto so much. I think, you know, in this book, this was the first time I heard the term Jane Crow described to describe discrimination Black women in particular faced. So again, thanks for putting me onto that term and idea. Even though it's atrocious, it's still really important to know. I think similarly, the idea of the Southern tier, Southern theater, sorry, the Southern theater, that was chilling. You know, we talked about the fight for Black Americans just to fight. Then there's the actual war fighting, which both of those just incomprehensible, I think, for most folks. And then there's this third fight, you know, the one they faced once they returned home, alluded to in the title of your book. Can you tell us more about what the Southern theater was and the new war Black veterans faced domestically after returning home?
Yeah, and I think maybe going all the way back to your very first question about sort of what led to this book and like why do we even need an additional book on World War II, and there's shelves and shelves of books, right? And part of what's important about putting Black Americans at the center of the story is that it's not just additive. It's not just saying, let's also remember that Black Americans were part of World War II. That if we put Black Americans at the center of the story, it actually changes our understanding of what the war was about, right? I think some of the key things that change is the chronology of the war. And so the war for Black Americans really starts before Pearl Harbor, because in the 1930s, they're already recognizing the really serious threat that fascism poses in Europe. And they're among the first to take up arms to fight against fascism in the Spanish Civil War before Pearl Harbor. They recognize what's going on earlier than a lot of white Americans do. And then I try to make clear in the book that the war for Black Americans doesn't end in 1945. They come back and dedicate themselves for fighting for freedom and democracy at home. And so that quote about the Southern theater comes from a Black veteran who said that we went from fighting in the European theater of operations to fighting in the Southern theater of operations. And it was quite literal. These Black veterans came back and they really became the foundation, the lifeblood of the civil rights movement. Someone like Medgar Evers, he was part of a group that helped to load cargo on trucks that were driven by Black truck drivers called the Red Ball Express. He was only 19 when his unit landed at Normandy, just days after the D-Day invasion. When he comes home to Mississippi in 1946, he's 21 years old. On his 21st birthday, he leads a group of Black veterans to try to register to vote in Decatur, Mississippi, only to be turned away by a white mob with guns. And that kind of experience of fighting for your country abroad, risking your life, seeing some of your buddies die, and then coming home and still being physically threatened just for trying to exercise the right to vote. Right. That was what the Double Victory campaign was about, right? That it wasn't enough to have these military victories, that you had to have actual freedom and democracy at home. And I think that's why it's so important to think about Black Americans in this history, because it really challenges us about how we think about the chronology of World War II. We can't stop the story in 45. Like, yes, the military battles were won, but there was still a important and even larger battle for freedom and democracy here in the United States.
Yeah, I actually had the pleasure of studying history at City College of New York, and Professor David Johnson, phenomenal professor. The first time I ever heard, he just casually mentioned, World War II starting in 1935, and then just went on, and I was like, I know you're not wrong, but I'm not sure the context there. And the idea, literally fascism created in Italy, and invading Ethiopia in 1935. That's something that most of us are not aware of, and I think it highlights, a few good points. One in particular, the anxiety that we have. I think we'll just look at post 9/11 of, there's a war out there that could be coming home. A lot of Americans didn't feel that, except for Black Americans, because they knew that could come here, and already is here in a lot of ways. And I was actually talking to a few friends about this recently. When I got out of the service, usually, in World War II in particular, usually you would deploy and you would come home when the war was over. But for post 9/11, you were constantly deploying, so the war was kind of always going on. And you come home, and it's, if you see something, say something. There's this tension. You don't know where the battlefield starts and begins, and that takes its toll on you. But there's still like a external enemy, whereas these Black troops were worried about literal people on their street, neighbors, people they worked with, and I can't really comprehend the pressure that must have taken on them to not really have the war come to an end. And I'm sure I sound like a broken record at this point, but I hope that speaks to how informative your book was. But another term that was new for me, thanks to your writing, which is blue discharges. Can you tell us more about what that was and how in particular they impacted Black veterans?
So blue discharges were called blue based on the color of paper that the discharges were issued on. And what they were is they were less than honorable discharges, but they didn't have to go through a court-martial process. And the two groups that were targeted primarily for them were Black troops and gay troops, gay and lesbian troops. For Black troops, they got hung up on these blue discharges because they were a way that the military could push out anyone they deemed to be troublemakers. So anyone who might have contested racism in the military, or anyone who didn't follow all the policies to a T, or anyone really Army leaders thought was not suited to military service, they could push them out by having them sign a blue discharge without going through a full court-martial process. When you look at the numbers, disproportionately, these were assigned to Black troops. And the problem was that made them ineligible for any of the veterans benefits they might have received after the war. Things got so bad that the Pittsburgh Courier, one of the major Black newspapers, was actually publishing a guide on how to avoid getting blue discharges and really warning Black troops not to sign up for these, because they seemed like the easier path out, right? If officers were threatening Black troops by saying, we're going to court-martial you for this, or you can take an easier path and sign this blue discharge, that's why so many people were pressured into doing it. But the Pittsburgh Courier already saw what was going on in 1945, 1946, and they were warning Black troops not to sign up for these because they had such long-term negative impacts on Black troops. But it's, again, one of these really kind of frustrating details of how administratively, through sort of a paperwork process, a punishment process, Black troops and veterans were treated in disrespectful and discriminatory ways.
Yeah, exactly. And unfortunately, that's something we're absolutely still seeing to this day for myriad reasons. Certainly before the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, that was basically, leadership had carte blanche to get rid of anyone, just saying you're gay, saying, character of discharge, you have a personality disorder. We're seeing this also, which is equally, I think, as egregious, but with victims of military sexual assault. If you are assaulted by your commander, they can just kick you out before you get charged, or sweep things under the rug. And just the idea of like intersectionality, if you're a Black gay veteran, I mean, just the idea that you virtually don't have any allies, especially in past generations. Really important to point out. And I think also Henry Osian Flipper, he was the first Black West Point graduate, and he had a bad conduct discharge because allegedly he assaulted superior officer, but they didn't tell the full story about him being harassed and assaulted prior to that. And he was defending himself. And this is something that you see a lot. I think Jackie Robinson had a similar instance. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, there's a bus incident at Fort Hood, Texas, where Jackie Robinson, at that point, he's in the Army. He's a lieutenant in the Army. He's well known already by being such a star athlete at UCLA. He's obviously hasn't yet become the trailblazer within Major League Baseball. but he's seated next to a light-skinned Black woman who's the wife of another officer. The bus driver thinks he's seated next to a white woman, so he comes back and harasses Robinson, tries to get him off the bus. Robinson, a proud man, like many in his generation were, isn't willing to accept this kind of harassment, and that's what leads to a case against him, that he disrespected, bus driver disrespected the military chain of command. Through some negotiations behind the scenes with the NAACP, they're able to get Robinson out without the dishonorable discharge, but he very well could have been shot on the bus, right? There were other cases about bus segregation that led to the killings of Black troops during the war. And so it's the whole trajectory of Robinson's life and career could have gone differently had that incident turned out in a different way.
Absolutely. And I think just instantly hearing you say that it's jarring, like, wow, we could have lost, this icon that broke down racial barriers. And you mentioned trailblazer, but in many ways we did. We don't know what the Black troops that were killed or, either abroad or coming home, what they could have done. And I think that's one of the things that we'll never fully understand, the contributions they made and could have made, which again, I think speaks that hypocrisy. And you touched on this as well. There was a pretty rampant notion that there were some people that were okay losing the war if it meant that they got to maintain a society where white supremacy reigns supreme. Does that sound accurate?
Yeah, I think one of the things I want to try to make as clear as possible is that there was no strategic or tactical reason to have a segregated military. And in fact, when you stop to think about it, it was overly complicated and it took resources to maintain the segregation, because it was actually someone's job to make sure that every aspect of military life was segregated. They had to have segregated barracks, segregated latrines, segregated recreation facilities. The Red Cross went so far as to segregate blood from blood donors, even though there's no scientific basis to segregate so-called white blood from Black blood. There was no reason to do any of this. Even more broadly, the military turned away people with advanced language capabilities. They turned away people with PhDs from Harvard, like John Hope Franklin. They turned away people with technology backgrounds who could help decipher radio messages. They made those people into cooks and mess attendants on ships. They didn't care about the manpower, the people power that Black Americans could bring to help win the war. They only really cared about the color of people's skin. And so from that perspective, one of the things that Roy Wilkins from the NAACP said most clearly is that his quote that stuck with me, he said, white Americans would rather lose this war than give up the luxury of racial prejudice. And it's hard to find the lie in that, because the military would have been a much more effective fighting force if they could take advantage of the capabilities and capacities of every American citizen. Right? The only reason they couldn't do that is because racial prejudice was so strong, they couldn't envision what it would mean to bring Black and white troops together. On the home front, there are dozens of strikes that happen in the defense industries when they try to promote Black workers, or when they try to introduce even a handful of Black workers into some of these defense industries. It's a sort of city by city, factory by factory battle. And so there's a case in Baltimore where white workers walk off the job for more than a week just because they're going to segregate bathrooms. Right? And what it means when these defense industries stop work, when white workers go on strike, is that there are fewer bullets being made, there are fewer bombs being made, there are fewer tanks, fewer trucks. They're literally grinding the arsenal of democracy, or the arsenal of democracy to a halt. They're making it more difficult to provide the kind of war materials that the Army needs to help win the war, just because they can't imagine the idea of using bathrooms next to Black workers. Right? It really flies in the face of the idea that Americans were doing everything they could to help unify and win the war, right? And it was abundantly clear to Black Americans at the time. And it's why it was so frustrating, right? To see this language that Americans had to sacrifice everything, and yet they can't sacrifice even some of the most basic things to end discrimination and segregation.
Exactly. And Terrence Holliday brings up a good point. And this gentleman definitely knows his stuff. So it's great to hear from him. And you pointed this out in I think a podcast or two, and in the book as well. But the idea, again, speaking of this hypocrisy, there were definitely instances where German POWs, literal Nazis, were treated better than Black troops. Is that correct?
That's right. And it's one of the most common stories that Black troops told about the war. And so this was typically in the United States. The German POWs were brought back in the United States, or people who were captured on submarines and then located on these different army bases in the South. And what Black veterans would say was that these German POWs were allowed to eat in the white-only section of the cafeteria. They were allowed to sit in the white-only section of the movie theater. They were allowed to sit in the white-only section of the bus. And so you have Black troops who see their white countrymen, their white American countrymen, being chummy with these Nazi POWs who just months before were trying to kill Americans, right? These were literally people who were at war. It was outraging to Black soldiers and Black veterans to see how quickly their white American counterparts were able to form bonds of friendship, or at least to treat these German POWs as equals in a way that they would never treat Black servicemen and women as equals. Right? And again, it revealed the hypocrisy, but also revealed that the end of the war. So I think a real problem was that at the end of the war, there were two conflicting visions for what America could be. Right? Mm-hmm. For Black Americans, they wanted to create a new vision for America, a vision that would truly be democratic, in which everyone would have equal rights and that there would be equal citizenship for Black Americans and for everyone else. For too many white Americans, they wanted to go back to how things were before the war.
Exactly.
Which meant a system of Jim Crow segregation that was essentially a system of racial apartheid. Mm-hmm. That was the exact opposite of what Black Americans wanted. And I think that anecdote that was told so frequently about white American soldiers treating German POWs with a level of respect that they wouldn't treat Black servicemen and women, that was one of the most clearest articulations that these visions of America were just not compatible. I think that's part of what fueled the urgency of the civil rights movement, because it took a long time for enough Americans to recognize how serious the desire and the need for full citizenship were. Yeah, exactly. And I think also just this running theme of hypocrisy that, the U.S. is fighting for democracy when we weren't even, I'd say arguably a full democracy until another 20 years after the war ended. And even then that's been super fragile because we've seen a lot of those rights be stripped away. And I think also just in the vein of, hypocrisy, we also see this abroad as well. The idea that, we're fighting for freedom for certain people. And we also, have colonies throughout the world and support, different colonial institutions. But before I get off on a tangent on that, just kind of bring it back a little bit to follow up on the blue discharges. The military can either set you up for success with a good discharge, benefits once you get out, et cetera, or certainly failure if you have the bad or blue discharge at the time, you don't have access to certain benefits, as you mentioned. And I think one of particular note being the GI Bill. Can you tell us more, about the GI Bill, the impact it had on the veterans that had access to it, and then conversely, how Black veterans were prevented from accessing it, in addition to the long-term impact of that discriminatory practice? Absolutely, it's a really vital part of the story. So the GI Bill was one of the most important pieces of legislation in the 20th century. It's what enabled a whole generation of white Americans to be able to move into the middle class. Because it provided those returning veterans with a host of benefits. It provided access to low interest mortgages backed by the VA, provided access to college tuition that enabled a whole generation to be able to go to college and earn professional career pathways, provided access to loans to start small businesses, provided access to job training, to a host of things that really enabled a generation to be able to move into the middle class. By and large, Black veterans were not able to access benefits in the same way that white veterans were. And that was largely by design. That when these GI Bill benefits are being created, they come through veterans committees that are largely dominated by senators and congressmen who come from southern states, where they're not democratically elected. They're elected by white voters because Black voters are largely blocked from being able to vote. What they do is they ensure that these GI Bill benefits are going to be distributed at the state level rather than the federal level. And everyone at the time understands what that means. Right? In 1945, 1946, doing things at the state level means that you're defaulting to whatever the preferences and prejudices are of different states. Right? That means that the South can determine who they want to give benefits to and who will not receive benefits. If it was at the federal level, at least there's some chance that there could have been non-discrimination provisions put in. That's not the path that they pursue. Mm-hmm. And the impact is that Black veterans are consistently either turned away from their GI Bill benefits or given the runaround and pushed into benefits that are less productive for them. So there are stories of people trying to get college tuition benefits to be able to go to a four-year university and being told, well, there's no point for a Black person to go to college. Why don't you go to this vocational school instead, right? Which has a long-term impact on the kind of education that they can receive. Because the GI Bill doesn't do anything to address the discrimination in the mortgage industry, it means that the vast majority of those mortgages go to white veterans, and that's true in the North as well. So in New York and New Jersey, the vast majority of the loans that are distributed to veterans go to white veterans rather than Black veterans. By 1950, it's 98% of those VA-backed mortgages go to white veterans rather than Black veterans. There's a group of economists at Brandeis University that's been calculating what the long-term impact of this is. And what they found is that over a lifetime, there's about a $100,000 gap in terms of what white World War II veterans were able to get from their GI Bill benefits and what Black World War II veterans were going to get. And so if you look at the vast racial wealth gap that we have in the country, a good chunk of that can be traced back to the discrimination that was in the GI Bill. The last point I want to make on this, though, is that there were still thousands of Black veterans who did have access to the GI Bill. So it's not the case that no Black veterans were able to get it. And what's important about that is the Black veterans who were able to access the GI Bill did amazing things. And so there's a woman named Dovey Johnson Roundtree, who's in the Women's Army Corps. She uses the GI Bill to get a law degree from Howard University Law School and ends up starting a law firm in Washington, D.C. and winning key civil rights cases. There's a guy named Robert P. Madison. He uses the GI Bill to get architectural degrees from Case Western and from Harvard, ends up opening a trailblazing architectural firm in Cleveland, Ohio, where he's from, and helped work on a number of different buildings, including the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So in addition to the large-scale discrimination, I think there was really an opportunity cost to the country as well, because the Black veterans who used it were able to do amazing things. And so I think the country really lost another generation of Black professionals. Right? We could have had thousands of more Black engineers, Black doctors, Black architects, if the GI Bill had been distributed in a way that was actually equitable.
Yeah, so many great points there, and you do a really great job of succinctly addressing them because they're super complex. And it reminds me of Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, which I really enjoyed reading. And that kind of pointed out the same idea that you don't really have to write the discrimination into the law, or the federal law at least, but you still get to appease these, white supremacists in the South in particular, because they know you can have whatever you want in the federal law, but we're going to make sure these benefits stay out of the hands of certain people. So you see redlining and other things come from that. But you mentioned the generational, the wealth gap between generations as well. And I think these are all, because there's still issues today. I think people don't understand where a lot of this context comes from. And a lot of it is really tied to this era, this generation in particular, because there was so much upward mobility available to certain people. And I think that's really important to not only know just because we need to know this historically, but also to understand where we're at currently. And again, I think that's one of the excellent things about the book is this is all very relevant for a lot of different reasons. Again, so this book, taught me so much and really changed the way I viewed a lot of, different things, be it the war, the treatment of Black service members, and in particular, the contributions made by Black women during the war effort. But if there is one or two kind of main takeaways from this book, what would you want folks to, either read in the book, which I highly recommend they do, or take away from this conversation? Is there one or two things you'd really like them to kind of simmer on?
Yeah, so we haven't talked as much about it here, but I think one thing that I was surprised about when I did the research was that the kind of work that Black Americans did during the war was actually really vital to helping America and the Allies win the war militarily. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is World War II wasn't just a battle of strategy and will, it was a battle of supply. And so by and large, Black Americans weren't in combat roles. There were a number who performed bravely in combat in the Tuskegee Airmen, Montford Point Marines. There's a tank battalion called the 761st Black Panther Tank Battalion. So there are those combat stories to tell. But the vast majority of the million Black Americans who served were in these logistical units where they would drive trucks or load cargo or clear jungles to build runways. But it turns out that kind of logistical and supply work is how you win a global war. And so thinking about the Red Ball Express truck drivers I mentioned earlier, they were absolutely critical after the D-Day invasion, moving supplies all across France and into Germany. They moved 400,000 tons of ammunition, food, and fuel. Without that, it would have been impossible for America and the Allies to move, shoot, or eat. Right? You needed these supply lines, and that's what Black troops helped provide. And so I think one thing I'd want to make clear is that when we think about the military aspects of World War II, we have to be thinking seriously about the contributions that Black Americans made. But I think the second and larger thing is that I hope all of us today can talk honestly about the real history of World War II. That World War II was a turning point in our nation's history and really in world history. But we have to be able to talk honestly about how complicated that time period was. And I think one way to do that is understanding what Black Americans were fighting for, right? that's why the double victory campaign is so powerful. That when we think about the World War II era, it can't just be the military battles, right? It has to be those military battles alongside the equally important battles for civil rights that happen during the war and continue after the war. A lot of what we're living with right now in terms of racial inequality, economic inequality, and the continued racial violence, a lot of that comes back directly to the World War II time period. And I think we do ourselves a disservice today if we look back and think that that was somehow a simpler time. If we talk honestly about the war, we can provide a better and more honest accounting of our nation's history that I hope can provide us a roadmap to how we want to try to navigate the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And excellent points as well. I think, again, looking at kind of current issues, this book, I think, really does so much beyond just talking about, Black World War II veterans' contributions. One thing in particular, I guess I'll always, take any chance I can to bring up Colin Kaepernick because I'm a big fan. But people don't really understand the complicated history that Black Americans have with the American flag and just symbolism in general. I grew up in the South. I went to a school that was predominantly Black and brown students, named after a Confederate general. And it's different when you've experienced and you learn these things, like you mentioned. And one thing with Colin Kaepernick in particular that people I don't think understand is, he would sit during the anthem and people found that disrespectful. So he actually met with Nate Boyer, former Green Beret, and said, hey, as a service member, how can I, get my message across without disrespecting the flag? So they compromised. He said, taking a knee is like the honorable thing to do. And people lost their mind because he was taking a knee, not because he was sitting. And the idea that they don't realize that I think, like you mentioned, we can think of the war, the country a certain way, but the perspective really mattered. I think you did a really brilliant job of explaining that. And I, want to thank you for that. Again, I would love to hug you for a little longer. We do have some great audience questions though. One in particular, this is pretty interesting. I think this, would love to hear your thoughts on this, but were there, kind of missions or kind of impossible to win assignments that were solely assigned to Black troops that you know of?
That's a good question. I'm not sure that there were any assignments that were any positive assignments that were only assigned to Black troops. Most of the things that were only assigned to Black troops tended to be what the military considered to be lower status jobs. It's like mess attendants on ships, the kind of building roads, the kind of grueling engineering quartermaster work, like building roads, clearing jungles, that kind of like hard labor is what they usually reserve for Black troops. I'm not, from my research, I'm not aware of any that were solely assigned to Black troops that were considered to be positive by the military. Gotcha.
Yeah, and I think certainly just looking at rank structure alone, usually the more dangerous kind of jobs are to the lower ranks. And I could only assume that, with, let's just say, a racist leader that had to task someone with something dangerous, I have to assume this happened quite a bit where Black troops were put in harm's way unnecessarily just to that end. Also, a question for you. If basically, you mentioned that, been teaching World War II for a bit, a certain way, and now you kind of view it differently. I think you kind of alluded to a bit of this, but what are some things that you do teach differently, or how do you view it differently after doing this research?
I think the keys for me in terms of teaching it differently are talking about the chronology, right? Making sure we start well before Pearl Harbor 1941 and continue the story well beyond 1945. It's trying to give some sense of the many, many different ways that Black Americans contributed to the war, right? I think we're at a point now where usually the Tuskegee Airmen will show up in high school textbooks, and so I can assume my college level students will have heard about that, but trying to give them some sense of what it took for those pilots to get to where they were, but then also the kind of work that Black troops were doing in these kind of quote unquote dirty jobs on the ground to help win the war, drive trucks, right? Or the kind of work that Black women were doing as nurses. I think that's important. And then I think the final piece is really taking the double victory campaign seriously, right? Really threading that throughout the war as a framework that this was absolutely vital. And so I think there it's talking as much about a grassroots organizer like Ella Baker as it is talking about a Medal of Honor winner, right? Because we can't understand the World War II time period for Black Americans without understanding both those pieces, because they're both were vital to the double victory perspective.
Exactly. Yeah, for sure. And Gail brings up a good point as far as healthcare. I think that's probably, equally reflective of their lack of resources. And unfortunately, like VA hospitals back in the day weren't excellent. Not to say that should exclude, Black veterans from having access to it. But unfortunately, I think that's probably all swept up very similarly. I think, one thing, Ta-Nehisi Coates, a great writer, big fan of him. His kind of like breakthrough piece was the case for reparations, and he, his goal was to make sure that we can have a serious conversation about reparations. And a lot of the examples he used was generational wealth due to the GI Bill. Do you feel that this a lot of the research that you did in particular can help contribute to that larger conversation about one, I think personally, reparations are due, but we can have a serious conversation based off of a little bit more of this objective information that we could put in front of folks who might discount it or be on the fence perhaps?
I hope so. I hope my work can contribute to that. I think our obligation as citizens, regardless of wherever we fall on the political spectrum, is to engage honestly with the past, right? We have to talk honestly in terms of evidence about what actually happened. I think the GI Bill provides a really great example of the power that the federal government can have to help shape people's futures, right? I'm happy that people's families were able to benefit from the GI Bill. It opened up doors that hadn't been open previously. It's really what made college education and home ownership norms among American society that weren't there previously. Right? It was uncommon before World War II for most white Americans to be able to go to college, or for most white Americans to be able to own their own homes. But understanding the discrimination that happened there, understanding what it would mean for someone's family to have been able to buy a home or an apartment in New York or Seattle or Chicago, and how that would appreciate over time, and how you'd be able to give that asset and those resources to future generations. If we can't understand that, it's really hard to understand how we got to the kind of racial wealth gap that we have today, right? We have to ground that in some actual evidence, and the GI Bill isn't the only place to look, but it's a really important place to try to ground that history.
Yeah, absolutely. And Patricia brings up a good point about kind of basically, thoughts on equity demonstrated today within the armed forces. And just to speak to that, it's certainly, infinitely better. Things are better, but also not by any means perfect. If you look at bad paper discharges, punitive discharges, Black and brown service members disproportionately impacted by that. You could even look at, you bring up a good point of talking about Tuskegee, but even now there's a huge, not representation of Black pilots, even to this day in the Air Force in particular. And we invested in a study with the Center for New American Security. And to your point about the power the federal government has to, kind of impact a lot of these different things. Basically, it says that, the report, the big takeaway was that minority veterans, they have access to benefits that other veterans or other Americans wouldn't have, but they're not, sheltered from just the racism and discrimination in America at large. So we definitely, recommend folks check that out if they have a chance or want to learn more about that in New York in particular. But we are running low on time. So just real quick, how can folks stay in touch with you, and anything coming down the pike that you're working on that you'd like to let folks know about?
Yeah, so in terms of staying in touch, I am on social media a fair amount, at Matt Delmont on Twitter. If there are any questions that didn't get answered here, always happy to get an email. You can find my email on the Dartmouth faculty page. So if you just search my name in Dartmouth, you can reach out to me there. And the book is obviously available from any of your favorite booksellers. In terms of things in the pipeline, so I think the next book project is going to be on Black Americans in Vietnam in some way, on both the war aspects, but also the important role Black Americans played in the anti-war efforts. It's at the early stages, so I don't have the whole story figured out yet, but hopefully in a few years, people will be able to find that. And then more broadly, I really appreciate the invitation to speak here, Derek. And I think the kind of work that the Black Veterans Project is doing, the GI Bill Restoration Act that's currently been proposed in Congress. I think my hope as a historian is that we have to understand history to give us some sense of how we can try to navigate the present and the future. And so I think anything I can do to help support that effort, always happy to do it.
Absolutely. I mean, you've done a tremendous job that already. I'm very excited to hear about the book about Black Vietnam veterans in particular. That's going to be great. But Dr. Delmont, I truly can't thank you enough for joining us today, and of course for the work that you do. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation and would love to keep it going. But we just want to thank you again, and the audience. I hope you found this discussion as insightful, enjoyable as I did. And like to just give a quick shout out to my colleagues, Maureen and Stephanie on the communications team. They're behind the scenes making all this happen, so we really appreciate it. And be sure to follow us at the foundation at NYH Foundation, and myself at Classic Decoy. You can sign up for our newsletter on our website if you haven't already. But again, Dr. Delmont, thank you for joining us. Thanks for everyone who joined and participated this afternoon, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.